The genesis for the GrowthBusters podcast was a documentary called GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth. Have you seen it? The film premiered in 2011, and so here it is 8 years later. I'm still trying to bust growth. Is the film still relevant? What kind of a conversation does it provoke? Find out next on this episode of the GrowthBusters podcast.
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa.
Well, welcome once again to the GrowthBusters podcast. I'm Dave Gardner. I directed the film GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth, and I'm hosting the GrowthBusters podcast. Today, I don't have time to do any late-breaking news or share any listener feedback because I have a pretty long conversation that I want to share. In my hometown of Colorado Springs, there was an Earth Day screening of my film, GrowthBusters, and we had a panel discussion afterward. After the panel discussion, a member of the audience, Sean Savett, came up to me with a million great ideas and questions, and we could have talked all night. And the next time I ran into Sean, he was still raving about the film and wanting to dig deeper into a number of subjects that the film raised. So I invited Sean to come to the studio, sit down with me, and kind of dig a little deeper. So in a way, this is kind of the extended panel discussion following a screening of GrowthBusters. So sit back and relax if you can. Sean's pretty energetic and enthusiastic about this. For the next hour, Sean and I will dig into the subjects raised by the film. Even though the film is almost 8 years old, people are still screening it around the world. You can organize a screening in your community if you'd like. If you haven't seen it and you want to see it, or you're interested in organizing a screening, click on store at growthbusters.org, then click on the movie, and you'll find all these options for ordering a DVD or a Blu-ray, including an option for a $60 community screening, or if you're a university or a library or a high school or a school district, $100 gets you a copy of the DVD and the right to show that in classes. You can rent or buy a digital download at Amazon or growthbustersmovie.org. I'll include links in the show notes to make that easy for you. If you want to do a community screening and you'd rather have a computer file than order one of the community screening DVDs, just send an email to me, Dave at growthbusters.org, and I'll help you make the arrangements for that. Sean Savett, I'm really pretty tickled to be having this conversation with you today. You finally saw GrowthBusters at a sort of an Earth Day screening of GrowthBusters here in Colorado Springs, where we both live. And we've known each other for quite a while. We've run into each other because we've worked together on some local food advocacy projects.
Yeah. You've helped us with a number of educational videos focused on food. So we've had a probably close to 2 years now relationship.
Yeah. I don't know. We might stray into local food a little bit, but mainly I invited you into the studio for a podcast conversation just because we had a pretty good panel discussion following the screening of GrowthBusters. And of course, we never have enough time to cover all of the questions and ideas that pop up in one of those conversations, but you seem pretty energized about it. So I really just wanted to kind of tap your brain and also give us both a chance to kind of continue some of the conversations that got started in that panel discussion.
Yeah, very much look forward to that. I thought that was probably my favorite part. The documentary was certainly insightful for a number of topics, but the panel at the end, I just really saw an opportunity there to maybe pick up the conversation and get into some opposing points of view. And I think there's a rich conversation to be had on these topics from people who might know nothing about this concept of staving off growth. So
maybe let's start with the film itself. Maybe you could just share your reaction. Did it surprise you?
Well, yeah, in a number of ways. There's a few moments there that, a few big takeaways for me. One of them was just the reference to some of the studies with, having certain economists who are looking at zero growth models was very interesting to me. I have read very little or heard very little on these topics. Most of what I have heard prior to that. And some of what I've listened to, your conversations with researchers on your podcast has been more of big picture arguments. And I haven't really heard anything that's more economics focused. And I find that to be interesting because that's an area where maybe not completely unemotionally, but you can really get into areas of research where you could probably learn a lot and you can do certain models. That was one that I took away that I thought was very interesting. And other areas that I found really enjoyable was just learning about your history, applying to city council. And even though you didn't come out on top with the campaign, there was a scene in the documentary where you had walked away feeling like it was a success with the amount of people that had come over, and had voted. And I thought, I pretty much agree with that. The numbers I think you shared in the film were something like 40% or something. Might have gone.
I had 43% of the vote, but I was surprised I did that well.
Yeah, I was also surprised. And it does reinforce the idea that we have a community here who does care about this as a topic, because you really took a position that should have been, for all betting purposes, a very difficult, and who would have ever thought 40%, right? I mean, if somebody was just looking at Colorado Springs from the outside, you might think, no way does this guy have a chance. We're a fast food nation, Colorado Springs, right? We're the fast food chains dominating Academy Boulevard. This seems completely counter to who we should be as an identity. I'm
tempted to say that we might be giving the citizenry too much credit. In a way, maybe we are. If I was honest about what my take on that 43% is, of course, I have no way of really knowing, but I would guess that it was more about being dissatisfied with traffic congestion and taxes going up and long police response times and inadequate park maintenance and things like that. It was more about that than it was a true consciousness of how unsustainable a growth prosperity model is for a city.
That's very interesting. I can see exactly what you're talking about. To see potholes and all of this, right? This is something people care quite a bit about locally. But I guess getting back to the movie also, one of my favorite scenes in the documentary is when you're working with the people on your campaign. I guess another spoiler alert, so cover your ears here. But this is the campaign working with you saying, well, Dave is really not about anti-growth. He just has some different philosophies. And you had all these cuts in these segments. My favorite cut goes to you and you say, no, I really am about anti-growth and I think it should be okay to talk about that. And I wish that the scene had gone just a few seconds longer just to kind of maximize the impact, because I just had this feeling that everybody in the room, when you said that, was just trying to understand where you were coming from. So I actually wanted to ask you more about that, because I thought in the movie, was that just you starting out with the campaign and them trying to get to know you? That scene seemed both funny but also eye-opening.
What I should do is dig up the outtakes and let you just watch the whole scene at some point. But I was really thrilled when you came up to me and you said that was your favorite scene, because this was the very first meeting of my campaign committee, and I was thrilled that I had the good foresight to film it, because I was in the middle of making the GrowthBusters documentary and decided to run for city council. So I decided, okay, this needs to be part of the story. So I wanted to document that. And I remember at the end of that meeting thinking, wow, this was great, because it so perfectly captured my challenge of trying to make it okay to be against growth.
Right. Yeah. It was the people that would be most in your corner and you would think would be right along with you. And I'm sure they're coming at it from a well-intended standpoint where they're trying to push the campaign forward. What kind of winning message can we adopt here? But, I just love that you stuck to your guns and said, this is really what we need to be talking about. And actually, I wanted to ask you as a follow-up to that, taking that as a platform, there were scenes where you were debating, I think, your opponent. You had some moments, I think maybe City Hall or other places where you're talking about this. Did you feel like you ever had the chance to get into good conversation during that political run, or do you feel like it was a lot of talking points and, maybe not the best conversation? I'm wondering, how many opportunities did you have to get out your best arguments for anti-growth?
Now that you asked that question, it was pretty unsatisfying in some ways. It was satisfying from the respect that I had the megaphone. I could get news stories. There were pieces done on me on the local television news, and that was something, if I wasn't running for city council, they always ignored me. So I got that, but it was pretty frustrating that if there was a news story done, it had to be a 60-second news story, or if we were doing a candidate debate, there was never more than 3 minutes for any one answer, and can't really get into it.
Right. Part of me really feels like with this podcast era, there are so many examples of where people are actually hungry for some sort of long-form discussion. Most people aren't reading as much as they used to with long-form journalism, but when you have this issue in a funny way tied to growth with congestion, right? You're stuck in your car, you're listening to a podcast. I think people are hungry for these kind of long form discussions. And to have you across from, I don't know his last name, the gentleman who was on the panel this past Thursday at the Tim Gill Center, Kevin, I believe his name was. So you normally play the host and the moderator to some extent with these types of conversations. But, you know, at some point, in the future, having somebody come in and having a moderated debate of some kind where you could structure some kind of conversation, because I feel like there were a number of points that both of you were bringing up, and we just didn't have the time to get into them. But wow, what a great conversation that could have been. I wanted to share one of my favorite moments from that panel discussion that Kevin started with saying, wow, it's been a while since I've watched your documentary, Dave, and it just makes me wonder about things I've done. You know, he kind of had this moment where he was asking himself, he's like, I'm wondering if I'm the bad guy and all this. And then I liked how you kind of came in and said, you're not the enemy. We're all the enemy. I really liked how you said that. And yeah, you can make arguments point by point, and there's shades of gray, and obviously some of us are bigger consumers than others. But I liked how you kind of backed away and said, look, we're all in this together and we're all our own enemies here. That was really helpful. I think you could feel how Kevin might have relaxed at that point and been willing to share a little bit more and not be so much on the defense. One of the villains in the documentary is the developer, right?
I felt like I had to have a villain. Just like, you know, one of my all-time favorite documentaries was Michael Moore's first film, Roger and Me, and General Motors was the enemy, and General Motors chairman Roger Smith, I think it was, a villain in the film, and Michael Moore didn't pull any punches. I mean, it just makes for an interesting story. I mean, how dull would it be if Darth Vader was a babysitter?
Yeah, this is right. If you were just so watered down that there was no opposing views. So tapping into that, I think that's a good point to consider, is that some of our favorite media exists in that realm, and sometimes we try to approach things in this very academic way where we're not taking opposing views. We need to grow up, and we need to say, it's okay to get into a conversation and have a little emotion in that conversation too. It doesn't all have to be this kind of laconic, unemotional, fact-driven discussion. That's not what's motivating people. I think when you look at politics, you know, obviously Trump era, I think it's people, they're beating their chest to some extent. You know, I think it's this emotionally driven conversation in large part. And I think we need to recognize that. I think when we talk about these issues, I'm on the other side of this a little bit, because one of the things that really interests me was the economics argument, which would veer in the other direction. But I think we just need to be aware of emotional issues. One of the big topics, and one of the most prickly topics that you would probably get into, would be the idea of population control. You know, people taking this to a level where it's like maybe we have some kind of policy from a government level that's going to prevent people from having children. And people go right there, like immediately, right?
Yeah, they assume if you're talking about population growth or overpopulation in a negative way, they assume, oh, the next thing out of your mouth is going to be, we need population control.
Right. And actually, so here's an area that I'm curious about because I know so little about it. And actually, your documentary resulted in me having some conversations with some family over the weekend. I was talking to an uncle of mine and mentioned your film and mentioned some of the pieces that had come up.
Oh, I'm glad you had a hidden camera running.
Yeah, I wish I could have recorded, because there were some interesting points that we even covered in our conversation. But the idea of good and bad incentives on population growth is an interesting idea, because I don't think many people are going to want to be in the realm of let's punish people for having kids, right? Many people want to be in the boat to say we want to take away resources from families growing up in poverty with a number of kids. It feels wrong to say something more like that, but how would it feel to say we're going to offer college scholarships to women who, instead of having children, might decide to pursue higher ed. I would be interested to know what you've come across in terms of incentivizing things, because in the documentary, it was very much the other way, where you had pointed out all the bad incentives that exist, tax credits, and I think you mentioned France and things that they were doing. But what about reframing and thinking about incentivizing best practices?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is how there are so many, let's call them perverse incentives to have more children rather than less. The welfare system in the United States is a good example. Almost all of your welfare benefits increase with more kids. And, we've got the child tax credit, which I think that just doubled this year, and that disappointed me. And yet, on the other side of the story as well, aren't you concerned about children having to grow up in poverty? I mean, you raised that important issue. And then last brought up was the fact that, the U.S. isn't doing it, but there are countries that are way ahead of us on the fertility reduction curve who have way below replacement rate fertility already. Some of them are starting to experience a contracting population or are about to, and because of their obsession with economic growth, they're worried about not having enough workers, not having enough taxpayers, not having enough shoppers to keep that economy growing.
Right.
Which is just ridiculous. But because of that, they're instituting all kinds of baby bonuses and trying to provide financial incentives to have more children. And so the big question is, if you get a good cold dose of reality and you recognize that 7.7 billion people on the planet is way beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, we all need to be embracing population contraction. Obviously, the first place you might turn is, well, can we get rid of some of those incentives? And certainly just the baby bonuses ought to go away. But how can we do it more fairly?
Right.
And I'm constantly thinking about this. We don't talk about it very much. I should back up and say, number one, we aren't going to do population control. Even if I believed that we should legislate family size, I'm smart enough to know that that's going nowhere.
Right. If someone even took that position, I think it would be a violent, potential disagreement. Because I think that gets into religion. I mean, these are some of the deepest values that people maintain. And I know I shared with you, if you take the Catholic faith, for example, it's very important that you're having children. They're not foolish about the future of the faith resting in the children. And I don't mean to frame that in a completely negative way. I think there's some good intent behind that. There's a community of people that are seeing their values, their cultural traditions being carried on. There's a transmittance of you have your own children. I'm just kind of waiting for the moment, and I don't know that we're there, maybe even just from a cultural evolutionary standpoint, to say that this is a global community and that cultural transmittance does not have to mean biological children. It could absolutely mean adopting in, having in, opening to some extent doors to people around the world who really need our help. They need our resources. We have climate refugees now, right? This is all connected. We have those options and those opportunities, but we have to be willing to give up something along the way. We don't get to have everything our way.
Just like in that panel discussion, you've given me 10 things that I really want to respond to. And there's probably not enough time, and my memory probably won't serve to really revisit them. But, fortunately, even though there are several world religions that really are pro-natal, it seems that most of the flock don't really follow that. They may believe that's a valid doctrine, but it's not for me. So the Catholic Church really says it's a sin if you use artificial contraception. And yet Catholics, they use contraception actually more than just the average populace in many parts of the world.
Absolutely.
So thank goodness for that. But I thought maybe part of where you were going with that was one reason that legislating family size wouldn't work is that it would be a violation of procreative freedom.
I wasn't going there, but I think that's another great point.
And I wouldn't have even come up with that. I wouldn't have even called it that except for my conversations with this great ethicist, Travis Reeder, who guested on the Overpopulation podcast, which I also host. And that was kind of an earlier episode over a year ago. It would be worth revisiting if you're interested in that. But I really think it's legitimate to question whether we really have a right to have as many kids as we want. But I also think that's a tough argument, and I don't think we necessarily need to have that argument. And I know several people who do think and advocate some kind of legislative limit on family size. And what I say to them is, well, You have a radio transmitter, and you're going to be trying to educate the world about overpopulation and that we need to start contracting our population. If this is your message that we need to legislate family size, then you've just turned the power down on your transmitter, way down, way down, because you're slamming doors. And there are so many people that you won't be able to have the conversation with because they're not going to go there.
Right.
And so I hate the word population control. I won't use it. We need self-control.
Yeah, you're right. As far as framing an argument, I think you're going to find yourself narrowed so far that you are not going to reach anyone with that. And I think we should start with incentives, because I think if we start there and we have the idea that there's going to be more resources for fewer people, basically, if we can think of a future where there are, going to be more abundance for a certain amount of people, then we can start thinking about how to incentivize that sort of behavior. Because one kind of parallel to thinking about food, and there's so many easy ones when you think of over extraction, overgrowth, just out east in Colorado, when you go out there to see the factory farms and you see how they're pulling water at an unsustainable rate from the Ogallala aquifer. And all along the way of that food chain is a series of bad incentives, of subsidies and deal making. I mean, it's just one thing after another. And I have to kind of believe, like with what you're saying with the transmitters on, and you're making the best argument that's reaching out there, is that there still are business opportunities for keeping people healthy. It seems like wherever you look at, say it's just a McDonald's hamburger, and you look at all of the abuses that happen on the way to having that burger served to somebody, it seems like you can have a nice parallel to having, say it's a plant-based version of that, and making people healthier, spending less money, taking less resources. The carbon footprint is lightened up a bit. It's almost like one good decision leads to a few others. To kind of circle back to incentives and the framework we exist in, I just find it very interesting, but I'm not literate enough to really weigh in on this. So I'm kind of curious to know your thoughts on just this system we exist in, just banking, for example, just the monetary system that we live in. I think there was a few references in the documentary about this is based on the fact that it's all based on interest. It's all based on the idea that you're giving money to get money. And that particular framework is always going to kind of circle back. I believe the point in the documentary was it's always going to come back to extracting instead of maybe nourishing and investing. I don't know the boundaries there perfectly, but I've heard some conversations about dividends versus capital gains, for example, being one of those types of viewpoints where, if you're a shareholder in a company, many companies are valuing capital gains over dividends. And why not make dividends the primary feature? And I think some companies do this more than others. I think cooperatives being one of them that look at how do we take care of our people as a primary objective over valuing shareholders. I think that plays out not just at the largest scales, but down to individual consumers in the way we take out loans and how we repay them. And I just think, isn't that part of the bigger problem, that it's just you're born into a world that has these streets already kind of paved this way? I don't know.
Well, you've obviously taken more than one semester of economics.
No, I would love to. I have no experience with economics.
Wow.
So it's just
because you seem to have this curiosity about it. So
yeah, I just find it interesting because it's the things that we're not doing any extra effort on. It's the idea that, well, I work at University of Colorado, right? And now I'm enrolled to some extent as a default into a retirement plan. And I've been thinking a lot about this recently. It's like I'm putting money into mutual funds that are destroying the world, if you just want to go there, right? I mean, you're putting your money into companies that are, petroleum based. These are people that are all focused on extracting. And I think if every one of us took that moment just to say, with all the wealth that we have, where are we putting it? It's collecting dust, basically. We're not even thinking about it.
Well, and this is a good example of how we're the enemy. We all are. Over the course of your lifetime, let's be really optimistic and think that you're going to have a fairly normal life, just like the last generation did, and that you're going to be in 30 or 40 years, you're going to be retiring. I'm afraid that your future isn't going to look like that. You're You might be living in a cave in 20 years. Who knows? But if it goes well, over the course of your lifetime, you're going to assume that you're going to invest in your retirement accounts maybe $1 million. Mm-hmm. You know that you're going to need, or you're going to be told constantly that you will need, who knows, by then, $4 million or $6 million to retire and not have to cut way back on your lifestyle. So you're counting on those earnings to grow. They have to earn interest or dividends or grow in value. So it's really hard for you to say, okay, I want a world that is sustainable. You want your retirement account to grow. In order for it to grow, the only way to do that is to destroy the biosphere.
I really like that you went there, because that makes me think of a deep motivating factor with that, which is if I'm deciding between an investment portfolio that brings me potentially 15 or 20% returns versus something that's more community minded, that's 2 to 5%. There's a fear factor. I might not hit my goals for retirement. I think that's a great point. If I'm really just taking the time, and I'm pretty bad. I haven't. I kind of need to go back and look here. But if you're getting into personal finances, absolutely, there's a fear factor. There's probably less of a fear factor for me with no kids, but even more of a fear factor if you have children. If you think about your kids going to school, needing healthcare, going to have a college education, you have to absolutely make sure that you're investing every dollar to take care of the future that's going to be your immediate family's future, right? So I think that is another really great point, that fear can be this really powerful bad incentive. I wonder, how could we reframe and get away from that? I think some of that goes back to how we take care of each other as a community. I am inspired the more I read about, again, going back to cooperatives as a concept, the idea, I've been reading about how these communities are coming together to take care of healthcare, for example. That's one that causes a deep fear for aging individuals that might not have the family structure. People have moved away. What is going to happen, with me? Do I have to sell the house and leave my neighborhood and, the people I love and go into, maybe the next step is a skilled nursing facility or something? There's people who are now saying, let's not do that. Let's keep some of the wealth in the neighborhood and let's start employing people in a network of home care providers. And I wish I could remember the example. I think it was somewhere in California that had just done this, and they had teamed up. They were allowing people to stay together. And I think those are the most inspiring stories that I'm reading, which is just people realizing that, back to the growth concept, that when you hear GDP going up, that's not GDP for me. And that's one that I think is really important to enforce, is like the idea that when you listen to, even it's NPR and the stocks, and you hear like what's going on and the NASDAQ goes up, it's growth for who, and it's anecdotal, but many people can look at themselves and look at their neighbors and look at their coworkers and understand that my wages haven't gone up, even keeping up with inflation to some extent, and realizing that maybe the best chance we have is just to lean on each other a little bit more.
Yeah, but you're right that typically that doesn't get measured in GDP, and there's no big corporate gain somewhere, but there's incredible value to the people in the community that depend on that, and that's unmeasured. So that's one of the many things that we need to do to get unhooked from our addiction to growth, is stop watching GDP so closely. I
wanted to ask you really quick about, another point that came up post-documentary, and it was, at the panel again, where you and Kevin being the former developer, and then we had Jill Gabler, our city councilwoman, and I kind of like the panel even just in the structure. I think she's more of a center perspective, I would say moderate.
Yeah, I'll interject. She's pretty enlightened, but every decision she makes isn't exactly the decision I would like, but she makes more enlightened decisions than most of the elected officials. So,
well, I thought it was interesting because I like your example of, if you're trying to make the best argument to the global population, what is that argument? I asked you that question. You had a great answer. You said, well, it depends on the audience. It depends on who you're talking to. But for each of us, we all have maybe a platform or kind of a worldview that we're trying to run with. I thought it was really interesting to hear you getting into points. And in my mind, I kind of imagined it as you're yelling at people in a good way. You're yelling at people to get off the train tracks, right? It may be in a metaphor of climate change, and climate change is the train, and we have a group of people walking on the tracks oblivious to the train. You're standing on the side of the tracks yelling, get away, jump off.
Get out of the way. Yeah.
And that seems to be the only reasonable thing to do, is that when you have a certain amount of facts and knowledge, and that the train is real and it's coming, I'm starting to realize that there's this ecosystem of people Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being one of them, the Green New Deal, people talking about these ideas of like going forward in politics. Like we have to not talk moderation anymore. We have to push eject. Like we have to get off the train tracks. So I've been thinking a lot more for me personally, which is, well, is taking a moderate standpoint, which I tend to gravitate towards. I try to be more pragmatic in conversation and work on cooperation and bridge building and all these things. The more years, that I'm alive, I'm starting to wonder, am I the radical in this equation? Going back to the train, if I could just go back to the train example, while you're yelling, I'm the guy trying to casually move people. Maybe I'm on the tracks with them and just trying to softly nudge them off the tracks. That wouldn't make a lot of sense in that example. I think in that example, the only rational person is you. It's not just the how you discuss this in that example. That's the issue. But I think also the issue is, does the train exist for some people? Is climate change even real at all? There are some, I think, that are in that camp. But for a larger percentage of people, I think the question is, how fast is the train moving? We have this big debate, and I think it came up in the panel where you were talking with Kevin, and Kevin said, one of the guys that had been maybe in your documentary in the 70s said, this is it. We should be at this moment having depleted everything, right? So he said,
that didn't happen.
Right, and that didn't happen. So I find that to be really interesting, which is, instead of questioning what was wrong with maybe that model, has that model adjusted? What factors have gone into it? What I wanted to ask him was, do you believe, that climate change is real, or are you just questioning the pace? And if it's the latter, which I think it is for most people, why does it matter if it's coming and we know the ice caps are melting and we're going to have to change? Why would we not just, from a logical standpoint, make the change?
We seem to be very resistant to change, don't we?
Right.
Thank you for that train metaphor. I think it's a really great one. You haven't asked me this question, I don't think, but you probably know what my answer would be, is where is the train and how fast is it moving? And I think the problem that our society at large has, and the reason we haven't done what we needed to do nearly soon enough or fast enough regarding reducing our carbon footprint, is that it's moving so slowly it's almost imperceptible. So I think the train's moving very slowly, but I think it's like an inch away. It's right there, but because it's moving so slowly, it still doesn't look like an emergency to a lot of people. And yet it's still, if it's a train, it's tons and tons of steel that if you're standing on the track, eventually it's just going to grind you up.
Right.
We had that conversation about the approach. Should we be shouting emergency, emergency, head for the exit, or should we be offering a more gentle nudge? And I'll tell you, from the moment I decided to call the documentary GrowthBusters, I got hammered constantly by people saying, can't you come up with some positive message instead of saying, here's all the things that we're doing wrong? And I honestly believe there is a role for both messages.
I do too.
But I wonder if the train was a few miles down the track, it seems to me like then that might be fine to have Dave Gardner saying, get off the track. But it might also be fine to have Sean saying, oh, look at that pretty meadow over there. Wouldn't that be a lot nicer than these train tracks?
Right. Right. And, in some way of talking about that, I think those are definitely connected, because I was just talking to a friend about this. If you go back to civil rights era and what people were saying to Martin Luther King, they were saying, calm down, you're too radical, don't take such an aggressive approach. And if you don't have some people doing this, and I think doing it in a peaceful way is obviously the way to go, but if you don't have people taking it as far as possible for the conversation, you might never go there for the conversation. And then to your point with sort of the ecosystem of discussion and cooperation and momentum, if you don't have people in the middle who are making compromises and making deals, you might never get to the other point. So when people get really upset, they might label you as extreme and they say he's taking this way too far. When people get upset by that, maybe that's a good thing to some extent, because again, so many of us are emotional creatures, and if we're not challenged ever to think about things, we're never going to be given the opportunity to weigh into a discussion. And I just wanted to quickly give an example of a tangent where I thought, wow, it was such a great, so many different opinions on this, and most people don't share my opinion on this example, but the one that I think of is Black Lives Matter. And when Bernie was going through his campaign, and I think he might have been in Portland or Seattle somewhere, he was stepping up on stage, and there were a couple activists that stepped up and took the microphone from him. They just grabbed it, and then they took over this event, you know. A lot of people were really upset. They weren't there to hear Black Lives Matter. They were here to listen to Bernie. And Bernie just kind of backed away and just like let them do their thing. And that caused this crazy uproar. These guys are taking it way too far. I didn't completely agree with the tactics, but I looked at it as they are moving into the realm of discussion. They're being ignored probably to some extent. If you looked at media coverage around that time, politicians going into campaign mode, and they're trying to fight for any little inch of conversation and discussion. So when some groups do these outlandish demonstrations, and PETA, you know, being one of them, that's deeply hated, you know, like there are people like, they are going too far. They're putting a banner up there. Somehow that got onto the radio segment or the news segment, and now there's this great debate and people are being challenged. I think it's kind of wonderful when it's nonviolent.
Yeah, there's got to be somebody pushing the edge of the envelope and making it easier for the moderate people to kind of get into your slipstream. You know, unfortunately, it seems like most environmental causes, it's gotten pretty political. So you might say I'm pretty far left. But if I go way far left with my messaging, then that gives the center people a chance to move to the left and still look moderate.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. So I want you to have more debates, because I feel like if you had, you know, maybe get Kevin back on here and have this kind of cross conversation with you and maybe debate some of these philosophical points a little bit more.
Well, I appreciate that suggestion, because I hadn't thought about that in a long time, and I wouldn't have come up with that, and I'm not sure why, partly because there might not be too many people on the other side of the issue who would be willing. There would be some, like Kevin, who came and sat on the panel, and it's just like if you were writing a novel or creating a narrative film, if you don't have conflict, that's an essential part of the dramatic structure. Why not apply that to a podcast?
I love it. Yeah, I really do.
Yeah, so I think I might take that and run with it. I wanted to mention that, you know, we were talking about the framing and whether we should be shouting fire, fire, or nudging. And, you know, I think we're kind of getting to the point now where, in terms of climate and probably many other of our existential crises, you know, we're getting close to the end of the opportunity for us to do the right thing. So it might be less useful to do the nudging and more important to do the shouting, perhaps. But I think I see that happening. And I subscribe to the New York Times, and every morning I get an email from them with kind of little blurbs, the highlights of what's in that day's issue. And I almost always scan that, looking for things that I need to know or want to know about. And in yesterday's email, I was really struck by these 3 stories that they highlighted in this 1 week's issue of the New York Times Magazine. First one was, what survival looks like after the oceans rise. The second one was, how big business is hedging against the apocalypse. And the third one was, the problem with putting a price on the end of the world. You know, a year ago, would you have seen those 3 pieces all at the same time in the New York Times?
No, I always found it interesting to read what the military was doing throughout all this time. You know, you're talking about preparing for the future and maybe hedging bets and thinking about investment. When you read about what they're doing in Norfolk, Virginia, in their contingency planning, they are absolutely treating, you know, the sea level rise as it's an absolute fact. There's no escaping it. And we have to, from a military standpoint, adjust. So I find that interesting. And it does remind me of some conversations I've heard about hedging bets and business making this shift. Maybe they're going to be investing in places that, whether you're looking at Canadian farmland that is going to open up, or, you know, other places in the world that because of global warming, you're going to be having these new business opportunities. I find that to be unsurprising. I don't know fully what to make of it other than just my viewpoint. We're still severely entrenched in our outlook for climate and global warming going forward, and that more than ever, the social media bubbles that we exist in are really hurting us. Going back to the train, it's like, we have to agree that the train is moving. We have to get there somehow. So I'm maybe encouraged a bit that the coverage is increasing on those fronts.
But you're right that not surprised, but maybe a little disappointed that people are figuring out ways to profit from the apocalypse, let's say. And we need to probably move beyond that. And I think that takes us back to something that I did say in the GrowthBusters documentary, and I probably didn't push it as much as I would today if I were making that film over again, and that was our obsession with growth. It's like our operating system. It is such a fundamental belief that underlies almost everything we do that next year is going to be better than this year. We're going to be making more money next year than this year. Our retirement accounts have to grow. Economic throughput is healthy if there's more of it this year than last. If we buy more on Black Friday this year than last year, that's better. If we started building more houses this month than last month, that's better. That's this growth operating system. And it's like when you have that operating system, everybody who's writing apps writes apps that run on that operating system. And so
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so everything we're developing, the new business plans and even the solutions tend to be developed to work in that system. And it's like modern society, we're running it on MS-DOS.
Yeah.
We need a whole new operating system.
Windows 95, right? So yeah, can I go back to, I just love where you were going with that, because this is to Kevin's point, back to your panel discussion where he said people are going to do what makes them happy, and growth as a concept seems to be where people are finding happiness. And what I think is happening, if you have any kind of intuitive moments, maybe self-reflection, if you're meditating or just breathing or walking, out in a park or anything, I think if you just take a moment and you think about something like what you just said, which is next year is going to be better than last. A lot of people are looking at that like, I might be making a little bit more money next year, or I'm looking at this job opportunity. But when people really plan and they think about how they want to spend maybe their money or their time, they're usually, at least in my experience, they're usually thinking about people. They're thinking about travel. I read some statistics recently, which is, how do people with a lot of wealth spend their money? What's the number one thing they spend it on? Travel. So it's not a surprise when people are starting to think about what is it that really makes me happy? It's usually spending time with people I enjoy being around. And we tend to think like that, but then I think we're distracted along the way, to your point with Black Friday, other deals, Amazon, ads that are starting to get so smart that they're popping up right in our inboxes or other places that, they know our habits, they know what we want. And I think along the way, we're corrupted. Food is one of the easiest ones to think about, which is, in the future with my budget, I'm going to go and I'm going to meal plan and I'm going to prep and I want to cook. And then along the way, we're distracted, right? One too many birthday cakes, or maybe one too many stopping offs at the fast food chain. So I think along the way we're corrupted by things that are just in the environment. And I would love to read some research, maybe, we'll find an article to talk about another time, but just how do people feel after Black Friday? How does the Saturday feel? Did I eat too much? Did I buy too much? Oh man, did I max out my credit card? There's a guilt that's happening immediately after some of these things because we know we bought things that we didn't need. And so I think that's an intuitive side of us that I think we know what makes us happy, and I don't think it's growth. That's what I wanted to get back to, is that I think that's not the right point. It's not growth necessarily. Resources, certainly. I mean, if we don't have the ability to have lunch and dinner today, and then we're searching for food tomorrow, we're going to be struggling to have some level of happiness. We're going to have a pressure there that is a big deal, but the idea that the larger house, a few more things.
Yeah, those are all things where you're just trying to keep up with the Joneses. And all the studies show that once your basic needs are met, accumulating more wealth doesn't add to your happiness. So thanks for bringing that up, because I think that being in touch with what true happiness is a real valuable part of the journey to sustainable living. That cliche, no one on their deathbed ever wished they spent more time at the office.
Oh, I love that.
It's so true. No one on their deathbed ever wished they spent more time at the mall. No one on their deathbed ever wished they spent more time on Amazon.
Right.
What do they wish? They wish they had spent more quality time with the people they love.
And the stories we share, right? If I'm just talking to you and we're having a beer, what are the stories? The stories are none of those things. things. They're all about times that we got out and we spent time with people, and good storytelling are things that happen to us that were difficult. Sometimes we put ourselves in vulnerable positions. And I think all of that comes back to community and actually getting out. And when you talked about making the shift and kind of coming out from maybe investing like in a typical 401k, making that shift, if you're talking socially, there's a lot of fear there too. I think in my generation and even younger, you don't see organic conversation. A freshman class that I teach at UCCS, a fall class, when I give the students a chance to take a break and go out to the lobby, I'm immediately imagining they're connecting with people they've been sitting next to, and they're trying to work on, there's probably this little like male-female dynamic, I got to take a picture of this at some point. They're all on their phones in the lobby. And I get that it's a primary form of communication now, but wow, are we losing the ability to just even have a conversation? I think people feel awkward having conversations. Not to drift too far here, but one of the things I've always said is that I could tell a big difference between how my grandmother or my grandfather would tell a story versus how my mother or father would tell a story versus how I tell a story. You're finding this social fabric and the way we connect, it's disappearing. It's like a muscle that's atrophying on the way down here to something that I hope that we hit kind of a bottom and realize it's not really interesting or fun anymore, and maybe putting it away and just connecting with my friends is going to be really the thing that makes us happy. And I think we have to find ways of building in more reflection on what we've done. I do think tech can help with that to some extent. One of the things that I've been noticing on my iPhone that it's been doing is like at the end of the week, it says, here's how you spent your time. I don't know if you noticed that, so it gives you these little reports, and it does make you take a moment, stop and think, should I have spent that much time on Twitter? What was I doing with my time? And was I happy doing it? And
so how much screen time do you typically get in a week?
I think it's over 4 hours or something. It kind of breaks it down by app. I don't know if it gives me a total, but
So you're considerably younger than me, and mine tells me 30 minutes a week.
Yeah, and see all my news on here and people I like to follow on Twitter. It's and a lot of pickups in a day.
But I don't even want to call him a comedian. What would you call Bill Maher?
He goes by a comedian, but he definitely a political commentator.
He did a great thing recently about how millennials are having less sex and making fewer babies,
right,
which is a good thing. And
right,
he wisely said that, but he kind of joked about one of the reasons probably is because they're spending so much time on their damn phones.
Yeah, and
that's probably true.
Maher. Yeah, he really hits the nail on the head sometimes. Yeah, maybe it's good in some ways, but it's also maybe coming back to this concept of happiness and resilience, is that if I have days where I am locked into my computer and I don't get out and I don't have any contact or I don't have many conversations and I'm not around some trees or green or walking through the grass, I'm definitely more irritable. There are things that happen to you when you are just disconnected that way. It's very disturbing. The Gazette just the other week had a whole Sunday edition where they talked about mental health in Colorado, and 20% of the state are saying it's one of the highest rates in the country, actually, which is a surprise. With all of our sunshine, you'd think, we'd have, really happy, healthy people, but I don't know all the factors there, but there's definitely something going on. We're letting go of our resilience by relying on these phones and laptops and just our ability to bounce back from things. Something doesn't go right. Is your whole day ruined? For example, bringing it back to the student level, I failed an exam. Is my whole day or even my whole week ruined because I performed poorly in one moment? Or does that motivate me, and do I get back up after that? That's something that's really disturbing to me too, because it seems to be getting worse from everything I've read, the training I receive about freshmen who are coming in, that some reports half of the freshmen coming in have mental health concerns. I don't know if they're all diagnosable, but it's a fragile state.
Well, there's probably a lot of things contributing to that, and nature deficit disorder might be a part of that. And if we really let that train just completely roll over human civilization, then in a post-apocalyptic world, we probably won't be able to rely on Instagram and Facebook and iPhones, and we'll once again find ourselves sitting around the campfire telling stories to each other.
I love that. Yeah, that's where I want to be, at the campfire. And actually, one thing I wanted to mention, we recently just had some weather events, snowstorms and other things. It's really magical sometimes, even though it brings some, negative outcomes. When we have a snowstorm, it's this weird thing where everybody just has to slow down, and it's really exciting. You feel like a kid again. You're an adult, you got your day-to-day, but then you have a moment where it's, you imagine slowing down. And I was thinking about that related to, your documentary recently. I was just thinking how that's a good reminder of how the idea of, well, if I don't work 50 hours this week, what happened? Did things fall apart? Did everything melt into the ground? And, from a work standpoint, we're in this endless, wheel where we're thinking we have to keep going. If I miss a day, if I miss a week, but we get sick, there's weather events. There are moments that happen in our year where we just have to stop. And it's a really beautiful thing when we do it.
Well, Sean, it was so hard to get you excited and talking and to come up with things to talk about.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me over. This was cool.
Well, in spite of the fact that it was so difficult to get you engaged in a conversation, I hope you'll come back for many more.
I would love to, Dave. Thanks for all that you do. You're a real asset to our community, and you're such a great spirit. So thanks for, working with me and all that you do for our community. Really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks for caring. Thanks for coming. So that's it for this episode of the GrowthBusters podcast. If you think we're doing important work, we really need to get these ideas in front of more people. You can help us do that simply by recommending the podcast to people you know, also rating the podcast or writing a review of the podcast at Apple Podcasts or iTunes. So I thank you in advance for doing that, and thanks for listening.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters. Whoa.